Hey everyone, so we've had a fair amount of requests to take a look at this one, and it is something of a curiosity to say the least. Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter received an Xbox One back compat patch, and well, something curious is happening with it. What was originally a 30 frames per second game is now running at 60 on Xbox One X. Now, in theory, this shouldn't really be possible since back compat doesn't lift any kind of performance cap that's built into the original code. So what's going on? I mean, this poses an interesting question. Has Microsoft made changes to its Xbox 360 emulation system to make 60 frames per second frame rate possible? After all, typically up until now, all we've seen is performance that moves closer to target frame rates. I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like this, to be honest. So let's begin by taking a look at the original Xbox 360 version. And yeah, on the face of it, what we're seeing here is a pretty standard performance configuration. The game mostly runs at 30 frames per second, but when performance can't hit the target, VSync drops and you get some pockets of screen tearing. And now let's run some X footage of the same game through our frame rate analysis tools. And yes, suddenly we're looking at pretty much twice the frame rate. It's absolutely fascinating for sure. I mean, performance increases in back compat titles are indeed the norm. We all know this. Classic example here, Far Cry 3 is one of the worst performing games of the last gen, whether you're gaming on Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3, but running it through back compat, we get a nigh on flawless 30 frames per second, whether you're gaming on Xbox One X or Xbox One. Fundamentally though, performance is still capped. That title will never run above 30 frames per second on console unless Microsoft changes the 360 game code itself or makes tweaks at the emulator level. So yeah, what's going on with Ghost Recon is not really anything like what we usually see, and it's interesting to see a game with variable performance that can actually drop under 30 frames per second resolve so well on the Xbox One X. Obviously, doubling the frame rate gives a much smoother experience, and it does help to reduce a bit of the input lag on the Xbox 360 original, though I've got to admit that the controls are really sluggish on this one. It's not a lot 60 frames per second on X though, as you've probably noticed, but regardless, it's pretty close in most scenarios. And yeah, if you're wondering how Xbox One S fits into the equation, here's a look at three-way performance. You get the same kind of unlocked frame rates on the base model as you do on the X, and occasionally you hit 60 frames per second. But more often than not, you're in a kind of 40 to 50 FPS no man's land. But let's attempt to address the matter at hand directly. Has Microsoft actually turned off the frame rate limiter here in order to upgrade the Ghost Recon Advanced Warfare experience for back compat users? Well, in a sense, this title shows what could be possible on a certain style of game if Microsoft did exactly that. But I actually think that despite the original game running mostly at 30, the likelihood here is that the emulator is working exactly as it usually does. It's just that the OG Xbox 360 game code has a little kink in its performance profile that does dramatic things when run under the emulator. And it's highlighted here with little kinks above 30 FPS that you can see here. Fleetingly, performance is higher, suggesting that the capability is there somehow to get an unlocked frame rate. Interestingly, this often occurs alongside tearing, as if that helps the game to break free of its 30 FPS cap. A curious one this, I don't know, possibly it's something to do with the forced VSync implementation the emulator uses. Regardless, it's fascinating stuff. Edge case performance scenarios above 30 FPS on Xbox 360 seem to become the norm on Xbox One, transforming the game in the process with the extra GPU power. Now, the original code is probably running the way it should, but in an entirely different way when deployed on more powerful hardware. But assuming the emulator is indeed running to spec, and that Microsoft isn't trialing a removal of a 30 FPS frame rate cap, I do wonder, well, what would happen if that option was actually available to all games? Results would vary on a game-by-game basis, of course, but let's take a look at a title that actually does run unlocked on 360, GTA 4. Now, to begin with, in the intro sequence, you get a performance profile that's similar to Ghost Recon, That's not bad actually, and it's clearly running a ton faster than the original game. Happy days, except, well, here's the thing, once you get into the game and the GPU isn't really the limiting factor, the lack of CPU power causes sudden lurching drops. On the original 360 version, we're in mid-20s to early 30s for the most part, but simpler areas like Nico's apartment can cause some noticeable judder. On X, those simpler areas run at 60, but the more complex cityscapes have a wider performance delta, and GTA 4 just doesn't feel quite the same anymore. And I actually think at this point there's a strong argument here for a 30 FPS cap, just to keep performance more level, and that's exactly what Rockstar did with Red Dead Redemption, of course. Funny thing is though, there's a lot of fan momentum out there, a lot of requests for Max Payne 3 back compat support. That would be pretty good for Xbox One users, no doubt, but yeah, it would have similar issues as GTA 4 here. So yeah, here's a look at some original Xbox 360 footage, and you can see that it has much the same performance profile. So the issue with Xbox One X is that, like GTA, performance limits will jump between CPU and GPU bottlenecks, which can produce quite a jarring experience. I'm actually really hoping that GTA 4 gets full Xbox One X enhanced support, as I suspect that this would balance out the game somewhat, bringing frame rates closer to the performance level of the original Xbox 360 experience, but obviously with the advantage of native 4K visuals. So I guess the really simple question is this: how come the results of titles like GTA aren't ideal, while Ghost Recon seems to benefit so dramatically? Well, the Xbox back compat team has spent a long time working on their emulator, and performance has increased significantly over the years, but fundamentally it's easier for them to emulate GPU than it is CPU. If we look at the basic nature of Ghost Recon's visuals and gameplay, well, there's not really that much going on. Pretty basic environments, meaning that there aren't a huge amount of draw calls, and yeah, minimal AI. I'd wager that the CPU isn't really doing a huge amount, meaning that the graphics hardware in the more modern Xbox hardware isn't being held back. Now let's take a look at another Xbox 360 game that actually takes that one step further. So Bioshock is typically running at 30 FPS on Xbox 360, but the option does exist within the original codes to unlock frame rate, and this also disables VSync. Now in this scenario, the 360's performance level is all over the place, and yeah, running with the default frame rate cap in place gets rid of the tearing completely and gives a consistent experience. Running unlocked does have advantages in an FPS though, and it certainly feels a lot more responsive, but the tearing is obtrusive and ugly, and the lack of an even refresh is kind of bothersome. But years later with Xbox One X, well, the tearing is gone because VSync is enforced on the emulator, but more than that, we get awfully close to a completely locked 60 frames per second for much of the duration. In all cases though, it is still original code running to original spec, though the arrival of X-enhanced 360 titles does show Microsoft making changes at the emulator level, though it doesn't touch performance caps. What you do get is 3 times the resolution in all directions, enhanced shadow maps in some cases, and other graphical tweaks. But here's the thing, when the next gen Xbox arrives, we can reasonably expect a doubling of GPU power compared to the X, but CPU, that's going to be a proper generational leap, and I have to wonder, can Microsoft then do something at the emulator level to increase temporal as well as physical resolution? Could the frame rate limits in those old 360 games be completely removed, producing similar results to what we're seeing in Ghost Recon? I don't know, but I do kind of like the idea of developers building in forward compatibility into their games in the here and now. If, like Bioshock on Xbox 360, the option to unlock frame rate may not yield a particularly good time on original hardware, but having that option unlocks the door to a much improved experience on future consoles. Now, there's no way that the developers of Bioshock knew that this might happen back in the day, but these days everybody knows that the Xbox games of today will run better on the hardware of tomorrow. So maybe building in options to unlock frame rate might be a good idea. Alternatively, we can look at what games like Wolfenstein 2 are doing. The game uses dynamic resolution scaling to maintain frame rate, lowering pixel count to get more consistent performance. But it also has a native 4K mode you can enable if you want. Now, in the here and now on Xbox One X, This hits frame rates hard, but it looks great. Now that mode can almost be seen as a gambit towards future-proofing the game for future hardware. Assuming Microsoft can indeed double the GPU power of the Scorpio engine on its next machine, that wobbly frame rate should resolve to a locked 60 on the Xbox to come. So there we go. I sort of think that Ghost Recon Advanced Warfare is kind of an exception on Xbox One back compat then. I might be wrong here, but I don't think Microsoft is looking at tweaking the way the game works at the emulator level. Rather that the emulator itself produces some fascinating results here with the original code. But you know, maybe the back compat team will remove performance limits in future on more powerful hardware. After all, there's a 9 times resolution boost on X enhanced titles, so why not a 2 times improvement to frame rate when the CPU power is indeed there to get the job done. And in the meantime, I'll be fascinated to see more titles like Wolfenstein 2 that, whether by design or not, do feature functions that'll only really resolve at their best on next-gen hardware. Anyway, that's all from me for now. As always, like, subscribe, and of course, ring the bell if you're subbed for instant notifications when a new DF video drops. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching.